Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. We have our guest today, Will Tucker, and we are going to do some catching up and just general talking. How are you doing, Will Tucker?
Doing very well, Doug. How about yourself?
Good, 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 good. Well, it's early April, it's spring, and we wanted to kind of hit a couple concepts, catch up with the Dr. Deep State crowd, and tell you what we are up to. Um, so we're going to do that. I'll start talking a little bit. A couple months ago, I said, I was really in the home stretch with the book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse. I took some time off and I read a number of books that have fed into what I'm doing. And I could go over a couple of the books with you and some of the ideas that Will and I have been exchanging. Before we get into it, Will and I have had a couple kind of fun encounters that we could maybe recap with you. Both of us were on the Venday podcast. How did that go for you, Will? Did you enjoy your time over there?
I did. I went extra long, and I think it was kind of a tedious slog of me reading for a really long period of time. But other than that, I think it went really well. I really enjoyed the conversation with Von Day, and looking forward to doing more collaborations with him in the near future. So look out for that.
Yeah. We were saying, like, if you have looked back a few months, um, my two favorite channels. Both read my book, and I'm encountering both of them. So Days, if you haven't checked out Days, I'm not even going to put the link in. It's a big channel. He was firing on all cylinders there on his podcast on Saturdays. He can go 3 or 4 hours and just hit it. So I'm friends with Days. We contact each other, exchange ideas. Maybe we'll have him on here again. So that was outstanding. And Venday, I think he is an important part of, he's an important voice out there. I think he's a modern church militant. He has a space that's different from the echo chamber, sort of in the trad echo chamber over here. And he's asking hard questions and he's moving forward. So to be associated with that podcast and with Venday is just it's amazing. It's amazing. So these things are going on with us, and Will are still processing. But it's hard to do in the writing process. I took some real time off, and I needed to read some material. So I'd like to go over some of the ideas that Will and I are batting around and where we're at with In Pursuit of the Metaverse. Will, any ideas hitting you big time lately?
Yeah, I've been, as you can tell, going into a lot of this Kabbalah research, and it's kind of taken me down a series of rabbit holes that I'm just now starting to be able to climb back out of. And I'm realizing that it's connecting a lot of dots, this stuff with Carl Schmitt and the politics of images in the mass media age, with a lot of my art history background. And so I've got a lot of enthusiasm and interest in researching this stuff, because I'm finally able to make sense of questions that have been haunting me for decades now. So I appreciate your patience with me, Doug, as I'm bombarding you with all this stuff and things that may be a little bit of a distraction from the book writing process. But I'm hoping to be able to rein it in here a little bit and start making it a contribution to how we're imagining the metaverse and the issue of sovereignty and the economy of icons within the sacrum imperium of the Catholic Church.
We'll discuss it a little bit today, but we both, we're working together independently, came on the significance of the sovereign through the economy of the image that I think pulls everything together, but presenting it is still the challenge. Off the top of my head, oh boy, I could go in so many directions today, but we have to cut. We're going to try to do this in an hour. There's a lot of words when you think about forces in the world that are not Christian but are Christian, and untangling that. But a couple of them are this Neoplatonic tradition. I can touch on that. But that becomes and is always conflated with and entangled with Gnosticism, which has its own characteristics. And I can go off on that for a moment. But what you don't hear in the modern discourse, and I think with the pseudo opposition to the World Economic Forum, people love the word Gnostic. And it's an important word. It works, but it's not complete. People fear the word Kabbalah because when we get into Kabbalah, we get into the political religion of how you take these Neoplatonic, apophatic, Gnostic ideas and put them into a political program. And that's where people, I think, are confused. They need to be a little bit more certain with that. And so at the very micro end of it, that's what Will is looking at, like the micro essence of the Kabbalistic political program and how the theology feeds what's going on right now. My book, there's certain limitations, and I'm not going to take it to that micro extreme. I just want to get the big parts in order, where the political religion and what I'll call the spectacle, the modern spectacle. I haven't talked to my audience. I guess I talked in the other podcast about the work of Empire from Hart and Negre. It's a Marxist work. And the spectacle is something that's now captured the entire world. It's analogous to the Roman spectacle that had captured the entire world. And it both feeds into the politics and the theology and our mindset, body, mind, and spirit each day. So it's captivated an entire world. And we want to dig into the spectacle and aspects of Baudelaire and Dubar. You pronounce his name better than I do. And so and so we're looking at that through the lens of radical orthodoxy. But I'd like to talk about a couple of the books that have influenced me lately and give kind of a shout out to a few people. Before I begin, any other thoughts, Will?
Yeah, and I'll follow up with my thoughts after you present your books and your reading. I think I'll be able to kind of do something similar to that.
I want to do a cast over everything first and maybe hit something so I don't. We're a little crunched this morning for time, so I want to talk briefly about the book Modernity as Apocalypse. I only want to touch on Charles Taylor, The Secular Age, Susan Buck's Visual Empire, Shannon Ross's book, Gift of Glittering and Poison, and a book I read called The Foolishness of God by a anonymous author. And all of these are feeding into each other and into the book. And there's just some amazing things that once you get them in, and I don't want to spend too much time, but let me start out a little bit. I know the author of Modernity as Apocalypse, and I believe Will has met part of the book. I would like someday to have him on the podcast here on Dr. Deep State. So I love this book for a number of reasons. It was done by a Catholic press, so it's kind of a small market. It's a part of the Catholic intellectual discourse. So it's kind of small and kind of tight. I actually believe, my feeling is this would do better in a broader market with open-minded Protestants. I think would really get into this. They're missing a lot of stuff here for a number of reasons. He got me into Rene Girard's work, Scapegoat and the Mimetic Desire. And once you get these ideas in your head, you just see the world differently. So that's a big, that I just can't unthink Girard now that I've gotten into him. He also got me into Taylor's The Secular Age and the moving of the eminent frame from the Middle Ages to now and where we're going in the future. It's a continuation of the closing of the transcendent frame that's been going on through nominalism and iconoclasm and what that means. And then we'll get into Susan Buck with that. So I really enjoyed this book a lot. And one of the things I liked about it is, as a Catholic intellectual, he, toward the center of the book, just started naming names. What is philosophy? It's a quest for truth, and we're trained in this our whole lives, and we're supposed to be living examples, sort of like Socrates. And so the post 9/11 era, he's saying he's naming all the biggest names that are, took all the praises for intellectual glory, kind of hitting low hanging fruit, I guess is the phrase of our day. But when it took time to really take the hard punches and make questions, really over the last 20 years, and forget about the recent kind of situation, everybody's silent. And why is that? And his book goes into the value of humanistic education and classical education. And that's kind of where I'm going. When look at the college programs right now, they're slashed. There's nobody's going. They dropped in half the humanities departments because they don't make money. And you know the story. But this is where we learn this frame of the ideals and embrace them. And that's what built Western civilization. So he talks about that, but it's also, he really pointing out a lot of problems. And then his other work, Thaddeus Kozinski is his name. In his other work, he's also doing a lot of work on the pandemic, and just he's a rare voice out there. And I think when people do speak out and take hits like he did, they should be recognized and appreciated. So Modernity is Apocalypse. I really enjoyed that book. You read a little bit of it, Will?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute there. Yeah, I did. I haven't read the whole thing, I'll admit. I've been kind of binging on a lot of other stuff right now. Really appreciate his takes on 9/11 and just sort of this obstacle of talking about, addressing truth regimes and how do we breach this question with people who it doesn't fit into their plausibility structure of reality. It's more likely that 9/11 the buildings could have spontaneously collapsed in on themselves in a uniform fashion, then everyone could be in on it and the media could be totally rigged from the top down. I think that idea.
I mean, some of that's old, but the idea of like holding people accountable, the top intellectuals that are supposed to be the truth tellers of society, when you've lost them, you've lost. So you can either try to regain them, but an idea Girard will say is like history doesn't move backwards. Whenever you want to go back to a primitive, perfect past, he's just a fascinating thinker. And I'll even say this, if you don't want to read Rene Girard, PBS or Canadian Broadcasting System about 20 years ago did a 5-part series, and you can get an overview of his thinking. But one of the premises is that history just doesn't go back. It has a forward direction to it. So for people that want to make kind of lifestyle communities based in the past, they're always going to have an expiration date because the world doesn't really flow together that way. But there's so many fascinating ideas where he pulls together the mimetic reality of the scapegoat. Just as I'll tell here in a moment, Ross does it with the spectacle. And these are both metaphysical concepts that we often in our world are misplacing with other things, other idols generally. Let me get into another book that blew my mind. And I got this as a reference from somebody. I believe the title's Foolishness of God, if I'm getting that right. And it's by an anonymous author. So I picked up the first page. This is when I'm trying to finish and write my own chapter. And the last thing I want to do is read another book. But this one blew me away from the second I started it. So it specializes in typology. And it's going to build into the state that we're maybe in called the passion of the church, which isn't just about the church. It should affect the whole world and Western civilization as everybody scapegoats, everybody, truthers, Protestants, atheists, everybody's getting their final lick on the church, and they're beating it in just as this is what the passion of the church does in typological terms. The church will be crucified, the mystical body, by the human element of the church and those outside siding with it. And all this, in the way this author put together the typology of this and what's the significance of this is truly the passion. Well, I was able to meet the author. He's a person of note, and we had an insane conversation. And I'll just end this by saying I was a little agnostic about what to do if there are big changes in the church. That would mean if the church, Synod of Synodality decided we're going to change some eternal definitions about who we are and essentially break the church, that there would be then, according to this typology, and gosh, this was well done. According to the typology, there would be a separation. So I personally wouldn't take any lead outside of other people in the hierarchy that I admired putting it. And so people like Lefebvre have also talked about this. He's getting this from Tertullian. He uses him a lot, the North African, 4th century, 5th century. He thought that some of these were really powerful. He was kind of a bit of a Donatist, and he had kind of one foot in the church and one foot outside, which is like a perfect framework to kind of look at where we're at. And we can maybe go into that someday. But to me, Christ was crucified outside the city, and that set the typology in place when you work backwards, that the church itself, when it's broken, the true church will somehow have to make some kind of separation. I don't know what that looks like. I think it's important to look for people right now in the leadership of the church that have embraced this typology so I would never broach any kind of advice, but it is clear in my mind that if we are entering the passion, I can't see how it's not happening, that there's something inevitable. What do we use for precedent? Like, how do we think about that? How do we feel about this? How does this affect our Christian walk? A lot of great stuff in there. So that book tripped me out. I invited the author on, Dr. Deep State. He's someone that's sort of known, and he's a known figure. And he said, I can't come out right now. How he could, if I wrote something that amazing, that was blurbed by Archbishop Vigano, blurbed it. If I wrote something like that, I'd have my name all over it. But he's a super talented writer, and that book really got me thinking. I'm not going to use any of it in Pursuit of the Metaverse, but that got me thinking. Will, as long as I kind of got a little flow here, anything outside of your kind of Benjamin and these kind of guys, anything else out there in the world that's kind of struck your fancy lately? Anything kind of quickly?
Yeah, the article that you also listed there of a Visual Empire by Susan Buck Morse is something that's been very impactful for me. We've only been able to find it on JSTOR. Unfortunately, she's a prominent neo-Marxist writer who writes a lot on visual studies and contemporary art, politics of image. And so this essay, it talks about the issue of sovereignty and the economy of images that's embedded within Western civilization that's being systematically undone through the mass media age, which is an extension of sort of the Marxist war on ontology via the proxy of the image. So do you want to go into that now? Are you ready to talk about
Here, I'll tell you this. Here's my recommendation. I don't know if I'm talking to agnostics or people that are curious about the faith or what's going on, Catholics or Protestants. I'll give you two recommendations here. In my opinion, this book, this is Shannon Ross, Gifts, Glittering and Poisoned. Princeton Press. This person is a Protestant. I think they align themselves with something called radical orthodoxy, which is a bit of a mixture between high Anglicans, tends to be between high Anglicans and Catholics. This is written by a Protestant. This should, if Catholic Answers wants to pick up on something outside the box, this is the most Catholic book you can read. It's written by a Protestant. This is so Catholic and understanding how Catholicism became what it is and remains what it is. So Shannon Ross, just insane. So this is about the spectacle. And what's fascinating is the analogs between the spectacle of Rome and how it was the glue that held the Roman Empire together and the modern empire of spectacle. And he draws from especially St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, and how at both times these are the glue. And we're talking the spectacle is the show out there, the dialectic and the amusements and how they draw us in. And in both cases, he looks at Augustine, his ontology of demonic, how they're present. So just viewing the spectacle back then and just viewing and engaging our spectacle today, you are engaging with an ontology of the demonic. And those connections were just mind-blowing. And at the same time, the connection between St. Thomas Aquinas, how we find ourselves in a type of Christianity sometimes where we just, this stuff is baked into the cake. I'll get into that in a moment. We got a Christianity that's been baked into the cake of the spectacle that Vogelin would call largely Gnostic Christianity. But St. Thomas Aquinas would say we're all locked in a debased ecstasy. We're not properly transcending the way our bodies were designed to through the hypostatic union. Instead, we have a miscategorized transcendence through the spectacle, a debased ecstasy. And what we need to be aiming for in each of our lives, if we have a vice or something like that, God will supply it. Whatever we're hooked on and those demons are just keeping us down and we don't even like it, there's going to be a parallel intellectual ecstasy that's God's going to provide for us. We just don't see it because the demons are kind of blinding us. But there's always an intellectual ecstasy that is going to take you from that. Because when Augustine would say, there's only one way out of this, truthfully. Now, I don't know if we can save civilization, but as far as saving our own soul, you have to exercise yourself from this. And I know there's a lot of hype now with Ripperger and the other people, and they're kind of making a show. A lot of this you can do yourself. You have to first realize, and this is why I was talking to Will, some of Will's information and who's guiding the spectacle, who's controlling the spectacle. But once you kind of realize that in the agenda, a lot of times you want to withdraw maybe piece by piece from parts of the spectacle. But I just believe that that's just so powerful that you recognize the spectacle and we try to disengage. And let's be honest, we're all attached to these things all the time. It's always maybe a bit of even a hypocrisy that someone talks about getting it out when we know but we need to do that. The Bible tells us to get out of the world, especially in certain times, just to disengage from her. And they're talking about the spectacle, and it's very analogous. For the early Christians to be able to make what they make, they had to, in many cases, Augustine said, you couldn't get catechized or baptized until you were exorcised. And so there was an entire process that whatever it took, and you had to get the spectacle out of you. And sometimes people were doing this, getting exercised, getting catechized, getting baptized, just so they could go into the amphitheaters and become, in repetition of Jesus, a burnt or violently attacked spectacle themselves. Going through all this, disengaging from the spectacle, and that's how this was all built. And it just sounds so strange until you kind of get into Girard. All religions have their formation in violence necessarily. This is deep stuff, but I think he's very convincing that we're mimetically, our desires trained, that eventually it'll hit violence. And the scapegoat was the mechanism to relieve violence. And until Christ came and became the true scapegoat, and only through Christ can humanity break the cycle of violence and degeneration into culturelessness. So so Christ is the true scapegoat. But for Shannon Ross and for Augustine, who would say this, he's not only the true scapegoat that stops the scapegoating mechanism, but Christ is the true spectacle. So he deliberately became the spectacle that we can embrace, we can gaze at, instead of the spectacle. So we're in a fight just like the early Christians. We're distracted by spectacle when Christ is the true spectacle, and we're engaged in the drama of the spectacle and getting distracted from the significance of what Catholics call the true sacrifice of the Mass. And so with that, I would just mention, for Catholics, the source and the summit of our salvation, I believe, is the same in the church as it is for Western civilization in the world. All points from Augustine and the spectacle to today come back to the Eucharist. So one of the other more powerful parts is Susan Buck, who's writing from a hardcore Marxist perspective. This, along with, are two of the most powerful apologetics for Christianity, and especially Catholicism, with a strong emphasis also on Eastern and Byzantium Catholicism. So this idea of the visual empire really explains in a unique way, they're probably not getting in theology departments, the absolute significance of the metaphysics of sacrifice, the metaphysics of the sovereign, and how the icon, the image, replaced that. And I'll go over and kick it to Will. This is the stuff that he likes to talk about. This is what's bringing all of our points together. It all comes down to sovereignty. Sovereignty, Hobbes would say in the 16th century, it's just humans contracting together. But no, it's got a sacred place. Just like the church. In a marriage in secular society, it's just an agreement. In the church, it's a sacrament. It's sacred. So it's got a metaphysical, Platonic place. Susan Buck would say, the Marxist. This is the conclusion she had to reach. This is the only thing that makes sense. We have a metaphysical connection to a king, a mediator that's part of the hypostatic union, and we misplace that in modernity. I'm going to let you go a little bit, Will. You've got so many ideas from this, but let me have you run a little bit on that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, one of the questions that Susan Morse poses is, how come, and she's talking about Thomas Jefferson's formula for permanent revolution, and how we need every generation needs another revolution in order to maintain democracy and to eliminate the problem of monarchy. And so she says, how come we can't cut the king's head off in a way that it will stay off? And she's talking in the context of 9/11 and sort of this state of exception that's declared by the Bush administration and the war on terror, in which they're given permission, or they claim sovereignty to basically enact these things outside of the constitutional framework of the democracy. And so she's posing this question of, why is it that sovereignty is this metaphysical category that's transcendent and is eternal and constant? And, with Hobbes's definition of the Leviathan is this concept of, sovereignty of the people within a democracy. How come it can't permanently resolve this problem of, a figurehead, a sovereign, dictatorial presence that steps into place and resolves that issue of the sovereign? So, I would say in this issue, it comes down to the concept of mediation, is that sovereignty is always a mediated concept, just as, reality in this realm that we occupy, reality always comes through mediation. And, in democracy, where we have the sovereignty of the people, supposedly it requires representative government. So the aspect of representation mediates to us what we want, and therein lies the problem of resolving the issue of the sovereignty. So she's putting this against the backdrop of Western Christendom and this economy of icons, images, sacred art, and how these hinge upon this aspect of sovereignty in the image, that the image contains some essence of the sovereign, that otherwise it falls apart into pure nominalism, in which it's just it's a stand-in. So this, she's writing in this tradition of semiotics and the mass reproduction of images that comes after photography and film production. So in 20th century art history and theory, this stems from this really seminal essay by Walter Benjamin called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And so, Guy Debord's essay or a book on the Society of the Spectacle, Jean Baudrillard's Simulation and Simulacrum, they're all pulling from, and a lot of also Marshall McLuhan's stuff on, the mass media and the medium is the message, comes out of this essay by Walter Benjamin. And so there's a political theology at work in Walter Benjamin that never really gets discussed. And this is what I was kind of hinting at earlier about how through Kabbalah and this research, in this issue of the sovereign, I'm starting to understand the influence of Walter Benjamin on 20th century art theory and his particular relationship with Gershom Scholem, the famous historian of Jewish mysticism. And then Walter Benjamin goes on to become a very important part of the Frankfurt School and this sort of post-Marxist cultural critique that we're a part of. So back to Susan Buck for a moment. She presents the idea of the divine economy of the image, which is present in the Catholic social order and in the sacramental economy, and even Baudrillard uses that in his 4 stages of the simulacrum. Is that the first stage is the divine order of the image, in which is a sacramental economy, and so that's the thing that has to be subdued and taken out of the way in order for this millenarian Marxist a new age to come about, is that this stable order of the divine image has to be subdued and subverted. It has to be stripped of its essence. And the sovereign that's contained within the image has to be taken out of the way. So she breaks down the etymology of the concept of an economy, which is oikonomia in Greek, which breaks down into the nomos, again, referencing Carl Schmitt. And oiko is the family, so the law of the family, the household, the sheepfold. So we have this already this issue of sovereignty, paternity within the concept of an economy. So I just want to make sure I hit all my points here. Doug, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull back. I don't know, because this is like, I'm trying to do this chapter right now and I'm trying to get my head around it. So I'm sure the audience, but I'm trying from a couple hundred feet up, the Protestant Reformation, the big things they introduce are I don't know how we can get into it. Nominalism and the iconoclast. Now, nominalism is what Charles Taylor is going to say. You're closing the eminent frame. You're starting with this whole world of modern science that's based on a metaphysical supposition that there is no transcendent. So this is a big part of it. History is historical. So when everybody wants to just take the frame and go like this, and I first learned this 25 years ago when I was studying historical economics. Modern economics just want to say, here's the rational actor model, forget about all the truths that we knew over the last 1,000 years. And so historical reality. So nominalism is just there are no forms, there are no truths, there are no ideals. And then you can start the political theology, the Kabbalistic project, but you have to have the iconoclasm. But Buck will brilliantly notice that when people say smash the image, this is the transcendence of the saints, are the Platonic version of ideals. We look to the saints, to ideals about how to become saints ourselves and run our life. It's the heavenly kingdom that is now, it's an inaugurated kingdom that we're participating in. So the Reformation is going to close the door. So they're going to deal with the world in an eminent frame. And it's going to highly be, what's baked into the cake here is Catholicism. It's a political ideology of Kabbalism with a certain presuppositions about evolution and the direction of history and our participation in history, which is where you get the whole world that we grew up in, is being your best self now, and self-actualization and determination, as Wilson would put into the whole world order. The purpose of nations is to self-determine themselves. So this is very close to sounding Christian, be your best self and all this stuff, but that's Kabbalah. It's literally a Neoplatonic form that you can predict how it's going to evolve because it's got certain parameters. It can only mimic and mirror the logos over time, and the eschatology and the eschaton of the logos are image. So whoever's doing it on the ground, there's a typology of the characters they're going to bring in the Antichrist, but it's almost predictable about how it's going to take a shape to direct minds and consciousness toward the acceptance of a Antichrist system or an Antichrist individual. So one phrase I like to throw out, we could think of the world in the Protestant or the first frame of Baudrillard's, where the images of the economy all matched the transcendent. The political regime was pushing us up toward the transcendent. And this is kind of like God's Overton window. And it's going to be historical. Reality comes from history that connects the heavens to the earth. And it's an ongoing thing because the perspective of God is seeing everything at once. So we participate to some extent during the Mass in that perspective. It's hierarchical, it's sacramental. So this is how you have a hypostatic relationship with God, the divine, the Trinity. It's historical. Reality is historical. It's sacramental, and it's hierarchical. And that's all based on one revelation of God that's been worked through in the Catholic magisterium. One grand. It gets fine-tuned, but it doesn't evolve in that sense. It's one revelation. So we know in typology, wherever there's a revelation, there's an idol. And so with the Reformation, we get the beginning of what I'll call man's Overton window that we know about. Ever changing, very political. And the war that we're in today over reality is very much, are we willing to stay in God's Overton window, or are we always switching to whatever man's Overton window is? Because more often than not, they're pretty much clashing with each other. So one thing that feels funny is sometimes, maybe Will's had this expression, sometimes you might say things to defend God's Overton window, and you feel kind of weird about it. Like, I feel like I've said something wrong or something like that. That's biopolitics. You've been biopolitically created and framed so that if you're sometimes really thinking and acting with your mind and body in God's window, society might say no, or you even internally might feel bad about it because you've spent so much time in the spectacle of man's window. And I'm reminded when the slave traders came to Huck Finn and said, "You got any slaves aboard?" And he lied and he said, "No." And he thought to himself, "I know I'd done wrong." And I think we do that a lot of times when we stand up for God. Sometimes even in our own bodies, it's like, ooh, am I bothering people? Should I not say this? But anyway, that's what's starting. We got these two windows that are forming, and one, man's window, is highly a result.
So this break within the Western tradition that happens with the Protestant Reformation first appears around and before the Protestant Reformation with iconoclasm, with this issue that seems to be embedded in the Old Testament law of the prohibition on images of the divine. So it would seem to the iconoclast that representation of God, saints, of Jesus, are idolatrous. And so they go about destroying these images. And this is resolved by the church in that these are mediators. As St. Thomas Aquinas says, we come to know God through analogy. So like you're saying, anytime there's revelation, there's also idolatry and the demonic that comes along with it. So the mimetic faculty, the way that we know things through their likenesses, through similarity, through analogy, is also the way in which we're brought into this demonic process that Rene Girard talks about that leads to the scapegoat and leads to violence. So with nominalism, as Buck uses the example of Hobbes, rather than these concepts that seem to be transcendent are something that are a priori and exist in the realm of Platonic forms, they're just based upon mutual consent and collective will. What we mutually agree upon arbitrarily to say is a concept that we're all going to abide within. So this is brought to the extreme with Marxism and within the simulation theory, in which all of reality is no longer real or accessible insofar as what we construct out of it. And this is part of that political theology of Kabbalah that's trying to claim its own realm, free from God, that can make up its own rules as it goes along through struggle and conflict and dialectics. So I want to say this, one of the things that I struggled with in converting to Catholicism that a lot of people do is this idea of calling the priest father. We have the verse in the Bible where Jesus says, call no man father, call no man teacher, call no man rabbi. So why are we calling our priest father? And then it never occurred to me, well, what do I call my father? My dad, I call him father. And is Christ telling us that we shouldn't do that? And I think this is this issue of us being analogies of fatherhood, us being instantiations of the Platonic form of fatherhood. That God is the true sovereign, God is the true father, Christ is the true king over reality, and we mediate that through our reflection of our likeness to that eternal form.
Yeah.
And this is the nature of meaning within our world. How do these things participate in this transcendent economy of God's revelation? So I'm gonna read this real quickly from Baudrillard. That I think puts it nicely. He says, all Western faith and good faith became engaged in this wager on representation, that a sign could refer to the depth of meaning, that a sign could be exchanged for meaning, and that something could guarantee this exchange. God, of course. But what if God himself can be simulated? That is to say, can be reduced to the signs that constitute faith. Then the whole system becomes weightless. It is no longer itself anything but a gigantic simulacrum, not unreal, but a simulacrum. That is to say,
Right.
never exchanged for the real, but exchanged for itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference. So the self-referential orbital
Yeah.
model of the simulation is what the metaverse is trying to accomplish
Yes.
by stripping the essence of God and the sovereignty of God out of the equation.
Yes. Yep. It's taking all the signs and the symbols in the economy of sign and changing it. And we can talk about economics or politics or sociology, but the magic bullet really can come out of an art department in the deepest way. And so we in the West, because there is a coincidence of opposites. God is both what we can say and what we can't say. But the medici, what the church held together is we have to be able to say positive things that in the cave, that God is real. He is something that is, and we know through analogy. So in the like Charles Taylor would say, in the enchanted world of the Middle Ages, it would be impossible not to believe in God, not because you were brainwashed to, because it was enchanted. The whole world, elves and fairies were real. But when somebody would look at a Madonna and Child or Joseph, Mary, and Jesus in an iconic, in a village in Russia or something, you literally experience the hypostatic union. Now, us in our sophisticated age, when we're bombarded and saturated with images, we aren't able to do that anymore. That's our spiritual loss. And part of this was getting away from that. Whoever crushes the image, and this is an important thing in Marxism, it's not the image, it's you want the control. So, you're going to put it in there that we can get a new interpretation of scripture. So look at me, not the church. So there's always this mounting control. It's never the purity of the scripture itself that mounts this. But at any rate, so what gets baked into the cake during the creation of spectacle in the Puritan age, we usually don't think of spectacle Puritans when we think about them as being people that are around the amusements and spectacle and porno and all this. But yes, the seeds were there between the birth of the empire from the capitalists, Kabbalists and capitalists in Holland, and they made that merger for empire. You sell out the scripture, we'll give you the hermeneutic, we'll give you a new view of the heavens, of the temporal reign. No, the kingdom is down the road. And so they're closing that frame, the Kabbalists and the Puritans together. And so that merger is still what's going on today. That is the neocons operating within the carnival of Trump's arrest and Putin's indictment and whatever's going on. So that's the birth of it. And it's important for us to understand that. Can we go back in time and reclaim this and look at an icon and truly have that? I believe in some sense we can. So what Charles Taylor's saying, we live in the secular age. It's not that none of us have any grasp of the transcendent. It's this, that we live in a pluralistic society. And so there's some of us that kind of have a currency of talking about religious ideas, and some it's a secular frame. The direction of the world, the metaverse, the internet of bodies, the noonosphere, the omega point, all these Kabbalistic ideas, which are baked into the spectacle, because the spectacle by its very nature wants to destroy every boundary. And it's pretty inevitable in the direction it's going right now. So how do we, even in our own minds, reclaim this, or perhaps even in communities? And I think when you I think it's like a muscle, you can rebuild it, that you can kind of learn through meditation, the simplicity of the experiential relationship, sometimes between simple verses. We know we do that through scripture, but also through images. And so once we open our mind to the transcendent realm, that realize that, as William Desmond would say, we have that reality is both transcendent and immanent, because reality is Christ, it's his incarnation. So that when we close one, we don't even know the immanent if we don't know the transcendent. The immanent knows itself, just like we know God in part through the negativity. We know God is good because we know what evil looks like. So, but the balance is important. So our tradition, we recognize God in an affirmative way, through analogy, through being, through images, that is mediated through his institution and his economy of images, which is in the Catholic Church. So I say images in a really broad sense. So what gets baked into the cake with the Puritanism, it'll eventually be straight up Kabbalah of people like John Maynard Keynes, if you've ever taken that. So we replace the economy of the way the economy would be used in the Christian sense, that's analogous to the hypostatic union. The regime would train all minds to connect to this. In the modern neo-Keynesian, we're talking about the Fed here and our logic of that, it's complete fetishization. So what's happened is the eye of providence that got us into this. God is a God of movement. He's a God of progress. And it sounds kind of true, that he'll bless our nation. Look at the eyeball on the back of the bill. This is the God of Adam Smith. But I believe it can easily become inflated and become kind of a Gnostic God, that God is there to bless and prosper. And it's basically a God that's operating exclusively in the immanent frame, ahistorically, without the sacraments, and with a rejection of hierarchy. And all you're going to get there is essentially the will to power, and their politics is going to dominate your idea of what religion is, or a hypostatic union. You are working in a large sense, when the transcendent frame is closed, you're really fighting against a ontology of the demonic that's going to substitute and look like Christianity. Always has. And you know that the Bible talks about this. You got to get this doctrine right, because the Gnostics that were in there now are basically the leaders of Christianity today. So the heretics have ruled the roost. How we deal with this in Catholicism, this is why Protestants can't get the paradigm. All the typology comes back to the church that replaced and completed the old covenant. So within that typology, the world will have both the wheat and the tares in the church, the mystical body of Christ, uniquely in the visible church through the sacraments and the hierarchy, along with the weeds. I believe we're at the spot today where the human element has not only taken over, but they're actively engaged in crucifying the mystical body itself. And it's sad. But what I bear in mind, I once got a comment, I don't read them, from, of course, not a Catholic, but a Protestant, my attack on, it wasn't an attack, it was whatever you want to call it, on Pope Francis. And again, with the typology, reality is paradoxical. And so is the church paradoxical. We have both the wheat and the tares. Catholicism it's a both and. It's not this kind of Kabbalistic thinking and or. So both and. So the chair, that's what we recognize in the hierarchy. It's the chair of Peter that holds the whole program together. A human will be sitting on that, and the human in the typology, in the same sentence, blessed are you, Peter, for heaven told you this, that I am that I am the Christ. Moments later, get behind me, Satan. So it's a confusing world. It's paradoxical. The chair is going to have both the rock and Satan. And most of the time, the miracle of the church is we still have the catechism, we still have the magisterium, we still have the unity. Despite all of the crisis, we still have it. Now, we might have a pope there that's a little bit more on, a little less on the rock side and a little more on the other side. But through my own criticism and personally, I now kind of have a little bit of a connection with him that I never had otherwise. So I do pray for our pope. It is as we're moving into the synod, it's supposed to be a talking church, so maybe I talk too much. But Will and I probably have to connect some of these in our future to the idea, what is the reality if the church is truly going into a passion? Do you want to, what battles do you want to fight, knowing that reality? How to walk at following Christ to the cross, what does that mean? And I would look toward other leaders in the church for instruction on that. But those are a lot of my ideas for today. And I'm sure I missed a couple different things, but the direction of the world is to take this pluralistic, many different beliefs. And right now, where we're going into pure simulacrum in Baudelaire's terms, it's an idea that nobody can make exclusive claims. So that's, of course, where we're at with the war in reality. And Days is doing his own version of this right now very well. But yes, any truth claims, and we're not just talking about who's a boy and who's a girl, but the truth claims of the church. Once we lose the one true, holy, apostolic church that is still connected to the sacraments, Protestants, as they beat on the mystical body of Christ with all their self-righteousness, don't realize they're killing Christ. They don't want to, they can't, they have the charisma, they think it's right, they just came back from the revival. But what was always baked into this dialectic between the Kabbalists and the early Puritans in England, what was always baked in it was, in Schmidt's term, a new friend-foe distinction. So who you used to call the users, the Antichrist, those who reject Christ, are Antichrist, now they're our friends. And guess who it is? The people that have the hierarchy, that have the sacramental economy, that have the history. The church started by Jesus. They're the enemy. And decade after decade, we're reading these. Christ will not come to the world until we destroy the Catholic Church. So Christians destroying the Catholic Church, it's a paradox. And again, the entire Bible is a paradox because there's a disconnect between heaven and earth. And how we're supposed to approach this, not through how smart we are, Gnostic insight, and penetrating the mystery of how this all works, but we have a magisterium to lean on. And we have a history to lean on. So at the end of the day, why do we do all this? I think it is in the confusion that is the spectacle, as the contradiction up, in this Jus Marlou kind of totalitarian trickery, that I would just suggest, this is my walk, but coming back to tradition. It sounds lame, but that's all you got. The truths are always going to be in tradition. The system, the World Economic Forum wants you to follow that hatred of the church down all the way into the true passion and the killing of Christ. And I kind of think I've said my piece for today. I got a whole schedule in front of me. I'm glad we could take some time and catch up. Will and I want to try to do this on a fairly regular basis. There are several guests that we'd like to get on to talk about whether it's their journeys or what they think is going on in the world. So hopefully we'll do that. Anything else that's going on in your own life or mind, Will, that you'd like to share?
I wanted to make one more comment about this issue of the unity of the opposites. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he separated the transcendent from the immanent. He separated the waters from the land, the light from the dark. So it's the sovereign the absolute sovereign who resolves the unity of opposites. And this is one of the tricks of the devil, is to occupy that space of the sovereign and of his agents. And in Marxist, Leninist, Maoist theory, the unity of opposites, by smashing these things together, by taking contradictions in the dialectic, the paradoxes that are that are part of the nature of our reality, they can occupy that path, that space of the sovereign. And this is part of that world immanent self-deification project. It's important also, you'll see a lot of people point to like Locke and Hobbes and say, this attack on Western civilization is about attacking capitalism. Capitalism is a stage in the world revolution. Capitalism is the Marxists want to harness the productive efficiency of the capitalist market system in order to break it apart, accelerate the contradictions, and then reuse it and recapture it into this, this project of self-determinacy and self-actualization. So
yeah, it's a big topic, but the killing of the king, because the king is a metaphysical reality, and we don't realize it from our 20th century, 21st century American minds. We can't imagine that this is actually a metaphysical reality. The killing of the king invites usurpation, and the power of the king can be scattered among many, but it's probably going to go in the hands largely of the oligarchs. Because generally from this kind of frame of the world tends to be either oligarchical or kingship, and oligarchs choose to, have front people for their projects. So where are we at today? There's a perpetual killing of the king. If we, the sovereign, are supposed to be, we're sovereign, we should be the one saying, hey, state of emergency. We're supposed to be the one calling that. Why is the executive calling a state of emergency? Because we're supposed to be truly the sovereigns. So we don't even believe in the deepest sense of the sovereign. So it's just it's a humiliating system where you're constantly. So that's the killing of the modern king, is taking the sovereign themselves and just putting them in the framework of a reality television show, where you're accepting like Christ he's a misplaced sovereign. And so you're worshiping the clown show, you're worshiping the spectacle. And so we don't have a real king. What's the replacement? I don't think it's to go back in time. I don't think the world works that way, but it is to connect to the true logos and the history of probably how that was fulfilled in time, largely through the economy of the image. It's insanely important, I think, to get our full grasp. What we're all trying to get is reality, and reality requires the transcendent and the eminent frame. So as this is closing and our minds are asked to be closed, the strongest thing we can do right now is find followers in the past. In the Catholic tradition, we have our saints to hold on to. These are the most important things we can be doing, is getting simple and traditional in how we are going to connect our own minds, bodies, and spirits back to Christ through the hypostatic union. I'm good with that, but yeah, the micro killing of the king through inflation, and Will's definitely for Andy Warhol and the soup cans. That was all about just inflating. There's nothing that can be. There is no blockchain of being. Nothing can be. Everything has to be coming, and so that's Chardin. You have to participate, co-evolve with this. And that's what's the spectacle. That's what's baked in the cake. That's what's in your Netflix, is that somehow it feels spiritual and you're connecting and you're taking your recycling in, or whatever part of this is. But it's false. It's false. It's false. And that's the idea of the Antichrist. He's going to be just a little bit better, more modern. He's going to be Christ that can operate within the Overton window. And the people are still stuck in God's window and using old-fashioned things and talk about marriages between a man and a woman. You will be crushed. We got to get going here, Will. It's been fun having our quick session. It's nice seeing you, Will, again. I hope you're doing well over there in Kentucky.
Yeah, doing great, Doug. It's been great. This was a fun talk. I think this was really successful. So look forward to next time, and God bless you guys.
Okay, see y'all, and see y'all, Dr. Deep State people.